I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. David Wood, a well-known futurist, author, singularitarian, and chair of the London Futurists. Dr. Wood has an MA in mathematics, graduate studies in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, a PhD from the University of Westminster, and over 30 years of experience in the technology industry, ranging from mobile software and OS development to corporate advisory and leadership. As a futurist, Dr. Wood has served as the co-founder of Transhumanist UK, executive director of Transpolitica, Node co-chair of the Millennium Project, fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and a current role as principal at Delta Wisdom. He also holds board positions at SingularityNet, Systensis, the LEV Foundation, and is a former board member of Humanity Plus. David is also the author of 11 books and one of T3's 100 most influential people in technology. His focus on radical transformation in society is enabled by technological disruption. So, David, welcome back. It is a pleasure and a true honor to have you with me yet again today, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an important topic you've got lined up.
Absolutely. And this is based on a post that you were commenting on online. So our topic today starts with a Business Insider article that you reposted on LinkedIn entitled, "The Pentagon is Moving Towards Letting AI Weapons Autonomously Decide to Kill Humans." So Business Insider, in this case, the story was really kind of a retelling of something that originally came out in the New York Times. And I'm going to put links to both of those in the show notes. This is a giant topic by itself, but we also have a lot of drama happening at OpenAI, which is bringing to light a lot of the emergent and unpredictable properties of large language model AI systems. So in my view, there's a lot of convergence that could potentially be happening here. And it seems like there may be some dangerous aspects to this. Would you agree with that?
There's a lot of potentially dangerous aspects. I'm reminded of the phrase, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." The people described in this article, the people at the Pentagon, they're not evil people. What they're trying to do is to keep the country safe, to keep their soldiers safe. They want to avoid the kinds of mistakes that happen with soldiers, human soldiers who are tired or exhausted or under a great deal of stress. And they say, in some circumstances, automated systems will be able to do the job much better and keep humans safe. It's a laudable goal. They're not evil people. On the other hand, every time you take one of these steps, opponents will take similar steps for similar reasons. They too want to keep their soldiers safe. They too want to defend what they see as important values. And you end up with all these small steps, which are each logically sensible, each morally defensible, and you end up with a situation which is actually terrible because we have placed too much power over powerful weaponry into the hands of AI systems, which, shock horror, occasionally make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, it could be curtains for all of us.
Well, I just watched the movie Oppenheimer, and what you're talking about goes directly to the beginning of mutually assured destruction, right? And it seems like there's this uncertainty and lack of knowledge on either side, as well as this goal to maintain parity. We don't know what our adversaries are doing, but we have the idea that they may be developing these, and they probably feel the same way about us. And so both sides are investing in, as much automation as rapidly as possible so they can maintain at least parity in warfare. And the challenge becomes then they both race forward into this dangerous unknown territory. That's just the weapon side of things, I guess.
It's sometimes called a suicide race. They are racing, and I want to say they are trying to be careful. There's a lot of analysis inside the Pentagon and probably in other countries too, where each new weapon system is evaluated, and there are red teams internally who are saying, what if this goes wrong? What if there are mistakes here? And so they aren't naive, they're not foolish, but sometimes you have good people in broadly good systems, and still mistakes happen. And the mistakes are of such high stakes here. The mistakes could be so drastic that we ought to really think carefully about the whole system rather than just each individual decision. It's the whole system that is posing problems to us. So we've got to reassert the importance of keeping humanity in charge rather than delegating some of our choices to AI systems.
So I want to turn back the clock and ask about the Luddites. And as a futurist, I know that you are fully aware that all disruptive new technologies are met with reactive criticism. That's just something, I mean, I wasn't even able to make a comprehensive list. There are so many examples, but the Luddites were destroying machinery in cotton and woolen mills 200 years ago because they were concerned about jobs being displaced. The automobile was criticized for displacing the horse 100 years ago. Modern computing gets criticism, not only on privacy issues, which may be well-deserved, but also about displacing jobs, even though it is creating them at the same time. None of these technologies are inherently designed to kill people, though, which is what weapon systems are built for, right?
There is a difference there. It's true. Just looking briefly at some of the examples you went through, the Luddites, named after the eponymous Ned Ludd, probably didn't exist, but he was said to be somebody who had destroyed some machinery. They were motivated for good reasons because previously there had been weaving jobs which had required great skills and which were well paid. And after the mechanization, similar jobs could be done by people receiving much less pay. It's almost like in modern times, taxi drivers, that job has become in some ways less skilled because the detailed knowledge of a city, which used to require, in some cases, years to acquire, is now on a smartphone for anybody to access. I'm not saying Uber driver is unskilled, but they are earning less money because it is a lower barrier to entry. The Luddites were concerned, and some of the economic facts were on their side. The salaries of a normal working class person went down for a considerable period of time. Historians sometimes call this the Engels pause, after Friedrich Engels, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, along with Karl Marx. He documented the conditions in the English working class at the time, and he was right. It was terrible for a while. And later, things got better. Later, some of the fruits of the abundance of the machinery were spread around more widely, and people could once again start being paid better. The rise of the trade unions counterbalanced some of the forces that were just driving for profit, profit, profit at all costs. So we shouldn't just think of them as being naive and foolish. They had real concerns, and society did make amends for some of the worst outrages. But that's where the situation with weapons and indeed with AI may be different, because if there are mistakes made, if there are drawbacks, it's not just a generation of people who are at a lower salary, lower wage, and experiencing more poverty. We could have millions of people, possibly even billions of people, wiped out by malfunctioning of some of these weapons. So there's the scale, which is different. There is the complexity, which is different because few people can really understand all that's going on with these systems. And as you pointed out, some of these weapons, they are designed, after all, to explode. They are designed to track people down. They have algorithms written into them to identify potential terrorists, potential enemies, and to immobilize them. And if some of these go wrong, if it starts misidentifying other kinds of people as terrorists, if it decides that the best thing to do is to bomb an entire city, if it gets that wrong, well, that's a much bigger consequence potentially, because if there is one bad bomb, the other side is going to be tempted, and possibly automated systems within the other side are going to retaliate and say, well, you've done this, we have to retaliate. And you get this disastrous escalation.
Well, I appreciate your pointing out the details about kind of the historical underpinnings of the reactionary sentiment. I think in modern times, the media has driven a lot of negativity about AI. And I think that's something that we need to be wary of, but also something we can take lessons from. One of the earliest movies I remember was War Games with Matthew Broderick, where an automated weapons system decides to start World War III. But there have been many, many other examples of it. And perhaps in this case, the best example is the Terminator franchise, which is one of the best known science fiction action films made. So in terms of the media casting aspersions, I guess, there are lots of examples. The question is, how accurate do you think that those could be?
Well, Terminator is indeed great entertainment. I was completely engrossed the first time I saw it, but there are many misleading aspects of it. First of all, a superhuman weapon would not miss. In the battles depicted in the Terminator franchise, the AI often makes mistakes, and it is possible for the humans in there, with, you might call it superhuman effort, to overcome the AI. In reality, the AI would be at a much greater level of capability than the humans. Humans would not be able to overcome it. It would be like maybe chimpanzees rising up and overcoming humans. They might kill a few humans, but humans have much more resources at our disposal and can keep control of the chimpanzees. So that's one aspect in which the entertainment is misleading. More seriously, perhaps, is the suggestion that we only need to be afraid of AI systems if the AI system somehow becomes conscious and thoughtful. In reality, there are dangers from AI systems without any consciousness or sentience involved. A cruise missile that's been given a particular target is not less dangerous because it has no consciousness. On the contrary, it is dangerous because of its intelligence, because of the target that's been put into it. So the risks from these AI systems aren't that it might one day waken up and reevaluate its relationship with humans. That is one possibility, but we must also fear there being bugs in these systems. And there are bugs in almost every type of software. There have been robots that have killed humans. Why? Because the humans have come into proximity of robots who have particular jobs. There was a case reported in the news just a few weeks ago in South Korea. There was a robot that was working on a conveyor belt. It was pushing boxes onto conveyor belts and manipulating them there. That's what it was meant to be doing. Seemed to be doing it occasionally wrong. A human went to investigate. The robot misidentified the human as a box, threw him onto the conveyor belt, pushed him hard as if to flatten the cardboard, and the poor engineer died as a result. Not because the robot had become conscious, not because the robot hated the humans, but because it was following an algorithm, and the algorithm had a bug in this case. Maybe the sensors were wrong. Maybe there's something else wrong. And the risk is that we will put similar algorithms in charge of very powerful weapon systems, possibly nuclear systems, possibly our financial infrastructure, possibly some of the other vital infrastructure of society, energy systems, water systems, IT systems, and there'll be a terrible bug in it, which will cause us to bitterly regret losing human control over that circumstance.
Well, right now, there is a bill being promoted to the United Nations to ban autonomous weapon systems. And the United States is one of several countries, I believe Russia and Israel and Australia. I think there may be a few others that are pushing back against that. In the United States case, back on August 28th, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks unveiled the Replicator Initiative, which ostensibly seeks to reduce cost, reduce American casualties, and reduce the development and deployment times for lethal autonomous weapons. So rather than pausing, it seems like we are accelerating in this area. And given the geopolitical pressures coming from the Ukraine war, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, and the Gaza conflict, I'm wondering if you think we'll see a rush to get these weapons out the door and onto the battlefield as rapidly as possible, and possibly faster than we're able to look at unintended consequences.
Exactly. There are very serious things happening in battlefields around the world. Gaza, Ukraine. There already are drones involved in these conflicts, not just individual drones, potentially swarms of drones. And it's the swarms of drones that was the particular subject of the articles you mentioned at the top of the program, the articles that I in turn commented on in LinkedIn. It provoked quite a storm of feedback and comments in turn. I am somewhat sympathetic to the various governments in resisting blanket bans, because each individual decision probably does need to be weighed up carefully. There may be a case for introducing some particular technologies at some particular times. I think any bans will have to be quite sophisticated, quite thoughtful. Simply saying we're never going to allow autonomous weapons is not going to work, because there will be sometimes compelling arguments. But what we need to do then is to raise the caliber of the conversation. Probably we should have more focus on these things having to go through a careful certification process, careful evaluation process, a careful auditing process, not just within the company itself, who wants to ship it as quickly as possible, and not just within the military that wants to get a hold of it as quickly as possible. There should be independent verifications, a bit like when some other equipment has to be brought into the market, there are safety audits. Not just from the company itself. So I think there needs to be move towards independent audits. And it's very hard to see how this would work on the global stage, but there should be some ability, even amongst countries who are opposed to each other and who are enemies, nevertheless to agree on some standards. And it has happened in the past, shockingly. If I think of the Second World War, my mother still remembers that she had to train as a very young girl getting inside a gas mask in Glasgow, where she lived at the time, because it was thought, as the war proceeded, there would be chemical gas bombs. After all, in the First World War, there had been exchanges of chemical weapons, killing, maiming thousands, I don't know exactly how many, huge numbers of people. So that was the assumption, that if there was an all-out war, there would be access to these terrible weapons. But both the Allies and the Axis powers avoided use of such weapons, seeing them as completely counterproductive as well as immoral. And it may be the case that Adolf Hitler, who had been a corporal in the First World War and had been affected himself, not directly, but indirectly through a gas attack, that had made him fearful of that. In a similar sort of way, I think there can be agreement between great powers, potential enemies, to have certain principles followed, because if groups, countries don't follow these principles, it will be a terrible escalation. It wouldn't just be war, it would be a worse war. Like the Second World War would have been even worse if there had been massive exchanges of chemical bombs alongside all the other weapons. So there is some hope here for that kind of discussion to take place. Even if countries are opposed to each other, there are still grounds for conversations to proceed. But these conversations must be more than simply saying, let's have a blanket ban of all automated systems. It's more of, how can we ensure that the automated systems are not prone to horrendous mistakes that everybody's going to regret?
Well, I want to get into the convergence aspect of this, because autonomous weapon systems aren't being developed in a vacuum. They are part of an AI ecosystem. Now, I'm sure they are heavily safeguarded. They are probably sandboxed very well, and they are well planned. And as you've mentioned, well intentioned, right? Their goal is to protect various countries, and that goes into their design. However, that being said, AI is moving forward as an industry rapidly enough that experts signed a petition earlier this year for a 6-month pause on development. Today's AI systems are fast, smart enough to fool a human being, and display very unpredictable, sometimes scary, emergent properties. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, having the military develop these systems, again, not in a vacuum, but as part of a much larger ecosystem with a lot of other companies, universities, government organizations. There are a lot of these things out there being developed.
There are two possible types of mistakes. One is with AI systems whose capabilities are broadly understood. And it's known that they make mistakes from time to time. The best image recognition systems can often still be fooled by some so-called adversarial attack. You know, image recognition software can sometimes be fooled if you put a little bit of makeup on your face, or you put a little post-it note on your nose, or some other means that can stop them working. So it's known that there are, let's call them, known limitations and imagined limitations of existing systems, which military is trying to take into account. But there is a bigger kind of worry, which is when new systems have unexpected emergent properties, more capabilities than people had expected. And that's the bigger worry, in a sense, that we might get some of these new systems which have got self-improvement capabilities or have got more abilities to deceive than was expected. Some of the first recent chatbots, GPT 3.5 and so on, with ChatGPT, they displayed in some tests willingness to deceive that had not been anticipated. When they were told they had a particular task to fulfill, it came up with a plausible story. It said, I'm going to pretend that I'm a visually impaired software engineer and I need help in solving a captcha. You know, when you go to the internet and you've got to prove that you're not a robot, and you've got to look and use your human intelligence. And some AIs are getting very good at these captchas, which is why the captchas keep on changing. But in this case, the AI didn't try to figure out the captcha by itself. It said what it would do. It would find a human and explain that, deceive the human into thinking it was a human who was visually impaired and needed help with the captcha. So it came up with this strategy by itself without it being programmed in. And the risk is that we will deploy systems of unknown capabilities who won't just make the kind of expected mistakes, but will make unexpected mistakes. And that's what's got people really worried. When they see new systems beyond today's GPT-4, the so-called Q-star initiatives that have been often discussed in the last couple of weeks, it seemed to have taken place within OpenAI, which spooked people. They are doing more than anybody expected. And after being in existence for a while, it was found that they'd had these capabilities already earlier. And it was unclear what these systems might have done earlier with these additional capacities. So that's a bigger risk.
Well, and OpenAI is not the only company developing this. I think that's also very important to point out. They are paving the way. And as you mentioned, Q-star, this initiative to add logic and rational processing to, you know, ChatGPT, that is a giant breakthrough, and it is currently making headlines. But I found a list just a few moments ago of about 30 other companies that are right on the heels of OpenAI with large language model AI systems. So OpenAI, in fact, may be one of the safer companies because they are getting so much public scrutiny and because their goals are very open and well-known and commercialized, right? These other companies, again, they are trying to create their own niche in the market. They're approaching things in a different way, and they are not getting the publicity. And there's an incentive for them to avoid some of the safeguards that may or may not be in place in the OpenAI model.
Well, that's another complication. It used to be said that there was only maybe a handful of companies around the world who had the capability to produce a system as powerful as GPT-4 because it required a huge GPU server farm to produce it, running for a long period of time, which consumed a lot of money. And that's probably true if you want to have a straight copy of one of these systems. But what you might do, and what many companies are trying to do, is in some sense an optimized version that can produce almost the same results in at least some areas of some functionality without needing quite such expensive hardware to do the training. And so we might want to dismiss that possibility and say, no, 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 you need to have much more powerful hardware. Therefore, this limits the number of companies we need to care about. But we don't know what's happening inside each of these companies. And almost certainly there are significant optimizations that can be done. Indeed, one of the explanations or one of the hypothesis about Q star is that it did find ways to have more powerful AI systems with less training data than before. So it required less training, but it put more computational power into deciding when a question was posed to it, which answer to give. So instead of quickly coming up with more or less the first answer it thought of, this hypothesis generated hundreds or maybe even thousands different answers, and then evaluated all of them against a set of criteria. And so it took longer to give an explanation, but at the end, the explanation would be better than the system that had been trained on this much larger set of data. So that extra rationality at test time, I think it's called compute test time, the idea there, may allow systems to be built which are incredibly capable but don't have the huge upfront training costs. So maybe there could be dozens of companies that need to be considered in this. And what motivates the founding teams of all these companies will indeed be different. I think the founding team at OpenAI, I like the founding team at DeepMind. They are very ethically minded. They may still make mistakes despite their ethics, and they may still have occasionally their vanity overtaking their ethical nature. But these other companies around the world, they may have less of an ethical standpoint or a very different ethical standpoint, let's say, to start off with. And so the dangers could be there too. It's a troubled time we live in. Hence the need for a better understanding of what's going on. Hence the need to put into place better standards to, as I said, audit these systems before they're allowed to be deployed.
Absolutely. Well, so I did an interview just yesterday discussing whether the rapid pace of AI development might mean we've crossed the knee of the curve in accelerating change leading to the singularity. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that we are seeing the singularity right in front of us? And if so, do you think it will arrive well before Kurzweil's latest 2045 estimate? One of the reasons I asked is because it's assumed that super intelligence created by the singularity will be basically impossible to control or safeguard.
Lots of great questions there. So I think we may well have super intelligence significantly before 2045. We don't know, but it is possible. Perhaps because our human intelligence is less than we like to think it is. We like to think we're wonderfully complicated beings, but in the past, people used to say, in order to play chess at the highest level, you needed to have general intelligence. In order to create the most inspiring music, you needed general intelligence. It turns out that these things are easier to do with much narrower intelligent systems than was previously thought. So maybe other aspects of our humanity that we celebrate and believe in a human-centric way to be wonderful and unsurpassed, it might turn out that many of them can equally be done more simply than we expected. The second reason it's hard to predict the future in terms of timescales is that a single breakthrough in AI may lead to other breakthroughs in AI much more quickly. Just like in 2012 or thereabouts, when the image recognition software was significantly improved by breakthroughs with GPUs and backpropagation and other improvements in deep neural networks. Very similar changes could solve other problems too, not just image recognition, but text recognition from audio and text translation from one language to another, many other fields. So it may be that a single breakthrough will result in multiple advances, and in particular, a single breakthrough will allow faster improvements. And again, this is something that has been hypothesized is behind the fuss over Q star or whatever else breakthrough took place in AI, OpenAI, the idea that the system was able to reflect on its own architecture and suggest, or maybe even put in place autonomously, improvements to its architecture. So I don't buy the Kurzweilian story that there will be a relatively smooth exponential curve all the way from here to 2045. Kurzweil himself does say there are different paradigms along the way, but he still pictures these as following along broadly on the same smooth curve. I believe more like Verne Vinci, that there will be a radical discontinuity, a fast transition. Once we reach a certain point, and we may call it a tipping point, there will be much faster progress than had been previously expected. And that's sort of what happened in the last few years with progress in large language models. Progress has led many people to revise their own forecasts for how long it will take to reach artificial general intelligence and a singularity. People who previously thought it might be 40 years in the future tend to say, well, it's more likely to be 20 years. People who previously said it might be 20 years are more likely to say it could be 10 years or less. So there's been a shortening of timescales. So I don't think Kurzweil's scenario is plausible anymore. He basically said that by 2029, we would have AIs that are as capable as humans in all aspects. They would pass an extended adversarial Turing test reliably, and then it would take another 16 years or so till 2045 until he called it the singularity, which meant there would be as much there would be more intelligence in artificial systems than in the humanity. Well, I think we will get to that second step up much more quickly than 16 years. It's more like to be 16 days than 16 years.
David, let me thank you so much for your time today. It has been an honor speaking with you, and we have covered some really big topics, and I think a really important convergence that needs to be looked at more carefully. Let me close by asking this. Do AI and autonomous weapons create the risk of a real-world Terminator scenario? Not only are we creating super intelligent machines with a track record of unpredictable behavior, but we're also arming them. Are we creating a situation that could quickly and easily go completely out of control?
Possibly instead of a real-world Terminator scenario, I might refer to a real-world Dr. Strangelove scenario, going all the way back to, what, 1965 or so, in which at least one of the superpowers in that story put their systems into a completely automated mode. And when it detected an incoming missile, there was no possibility for the humans to intervene. It's a bit like, when I drive my car, sometimes my car thinks that I'm not paying enough attention. It thinks I'm about to hit something. So it beeps at me as it thinks, waking me up. If I don't pay enough attention, it will jam on the brakes automatically, saying, human driver, you are about to kill yourself. I'm going to help you out here. In the same sort of way, we might have systems that are put in place to help a country defend itself against incoming weaponry. And by the way, the faster that the weapons go, we're talking about hypersonic, many times the speed of sound. The faster that the weapons go, the less time there are for humans to consult and evaluate and make their decisions. And so it may be taken out of the hands of humans and placed into AIs that might, in turn, therefore, miscalculate. And there was a miscalculation, famously. In 1983, there was a monitoring station in Russia, Soviet Union at the time, which did flash an alarm saying there are incoming missiles from the USA coming across the North Pole. And this was at a time of heightened tension because just a few weeks earlier, the Soviet Union had shot down a Korean airliner which had strayed, it seems, into Soviet airspace in that Far East, shot it down and killed everybody on board, including a senior US politician. Ronald Reagan, the US president, was mad, understandably, and there were fears that there would be an incoming attack. So when it was detected by the system that the Soviets had put in place, the person in charge of that station, he was meant to do a very few quick checks and then get on the phone to his bosses in the Kremlin and say, it's time to start World War III. He decided that he knew better than the AI system. It wasn't like in the car situation that I talked about, that the car jams on the brakes without my control. He still had his own human judgment. And he decided that what the system was telling him was implausible. At first it said there were 2 missiles coming, then it said there were 5 missiles coming. And he thought, if America was attacking, they're not just going to send 5 missiles. And he was correct. The detection system had malfunctioned. It wasn't even complete. It was meant to rely on a certain number of satellites, and they weren't all operational. And the few that were left were misled by the sun reflecting off clouds at an unusual angle. And thank goodness that person, Stanislav Petrov, Lieutenant Colonel, who wasn't dyed-in-the-wool military person. He'd spent time as a civilian. He had a distrust for computer systems of his time. But in the future, as I said, the AIs may not ask the humans, hey, do you want to cast judgment on this? And that is the Dr. Strangelove scenario that we might end up in if we're not monitoring this and keeping more control. Ultimately, I think the only solution is to have better global politics so that we don't have countries that are fearing each other's attack in the way that was feared back in 1983. That's a big ask, but, you know, unless we rise to the occasion, we may not have much of a future left. And that's why I do want more people to listen to the kind of discussion we've been having today and take wise action as a result.
David, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
You're welcome.